Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
Welcome to the Tuesday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. Glad to have you with us. Jim Garrity is still away, but he will be back in a couple of days. Here again in his place, we're happy to have Andy McCarthy, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. He's also a contributing editor and columnist at National Review Online, and he's a Fox News contributor also. Andy is recovered from his virtual and real martinis after yesterday's conversations on some pretty heavy topics. At least we think so. Andy,
remains to be seen. That remains to be seen. Right?
We'll find out. All right. So we got a couple of significant legal issues to tackle here today, and then one almost exclusively on the political side. But we yesterday postponed perhaps the most significant Supreme Court decision from Friday for yesterday's podcast. We're going to talk about it today, and that's the 8-1 ruling from the Supreme Court stating that it is constitutional to deny firearms possessions to people who have been the target of a domestic violence restraining order. And so the majority obviously upholding the law. Clarence Thomas, the only dissenter, saying his concern was over due process rights. And so, Andy, these are, generally speaking, known as red flag laws, taking guns away from people that you think are going to potentially be harmful to themselves or others, in this case, specifically others. The Second Amendment is always curious when it comes to the court, because you obviously have people who believe that any sort of chipping away at the Second Amendment is going to lead to more chipping away at the Second Amendment. And others say, well, this is a case where a person is clearly a threat, and so we're trying to stop a tragedy before it happens here. So what do you make of the court's particular take in this case and the Thomas dissent?
Well, it's really interesting, Greg, because in the wake of the Bruin case, I mean, all of this goes back to Heller, the famous case that Justice Scalia wrote in, I think it was 2008 now. So we're going back a ways. There was a New York case after Heller, which made clear that the Second Amendment is applicable to the states. Heller was a District of Columbia case where Scalia recognized that the right that is preserved in the Second Amendment, there's a lot that is wrong about the way people talk about the Second Amendment, not least that our gun rights come from the Second Amendment. Our gun rights are actually protected by the Second Amendment. They're fundamental. They're basically the natural right of self-defense. That's what they stem from. And the Second Amendment didn't create a right. It preserved that previously existing natural right. It was thought to be a check on government, that the first thing that a despot or an authoritarian regime does when it comes in is disarm the citizenry, and that's one of the main reasons it's in the Constitution. So Scalia found in 2008 that it's a personal right to keep and bear arms, which was the most sensible way of reading the amendment. The McDonald case, the New York case, is the one that says that it applies to the states. And then we went a long time without any significant Second Amendment litigation. So it was an assumption, Greg, that the federal restrictions on gun possession by certain categories of people, and you're right that they operate like red flag laws, but basically for them to apply to you, you have to be in these categories. So, for example, people who are narcotics addicts, people who are under a protective order, people who are under indictment, people who are illegal aliens. There's about like 8 or 9 categories in federal law. There was no thought after the first 2 big Supreme Court cases that those federal gun restrictions were in any trouble or in any danger. And I should point out that most of the restrictions in federal law, we're talking about Section 922 of the Federal Penal Code, which details all these different categories. They were codified in the law in 1968 legislation that was signed by President Johnson. And 1968 was a wild and crazy year in the United States, which included, among other things, the shooting murders of Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy. So this comprehensive firearms legislation was a result of the tumult in the United States in that year. And these restrictions on federal gun rights have now been in the law for half a century. And most people assumed that they were fine at this point. But then the Supreme Court decides the Bruen case in 2022, and building on what Scalia had said in Heller back in 2008, what the Supreme Court, I believe Justice Thomas wrote Bruen, and what the Supreme Court said is, when we said the original intent or the original understanding of the Second Amendment at the time it was ratified, we meant that. So if a restriction in federal law was not of the type of restrictions that would have been permitted when the Constitution was ratified in 1791, or at the very least when the Bill of Rights was applied to the states by the 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868. So whether we're talking about 1871 or 1868, the restrictions in law have to be of the kind that would have been permitted as the Second Amendment was understood during ratification. So this has caused a lot of angst, because the fact is that even though we've had these restrictions in our law for 50 years, they are not restrictions that would have existed and would have been permitted under the law at the time the Second Amendment was ratified. And we probably best saw that in the Hunter Biden case, or at least, it was raised to our consciousness in the Hunter Biden case. The Hunter Biden case is a layup under federal law as it has existed for the last 50 years, where it said that if you were either a user of illegal narcotics or an addict, the guns could be taken away from you permanently. And nobody questioned that for a long time. In fact, I think if David Weiss had timely indicted Hunter, as we discussed, I think last week, if he had timely indicted Hunter in 2019 for the gun purchased in 2018, Hunter would never have had a Second Amendment defense, because Bruen didn't get decided until years after that, until 2022. But after Bruen, you have to say, well, is that the kind of restriction we would have or would have indulged when the Second Amendment was ratified? And the fact is, back in those days, the closest, we didn't really have narcotics addiction as a thing. I'm not saying no one was addicted to narcotics, but we didn't have a drug problem like we have in the country today. So the closest analog that you have is, this is interesting, which is the closest analog. The one you think of first is alcohol abuse, right? So back in the day, if you were inebriated or you were in the act of drinking, they could take your guns away from you, but you would get them back. When you slept it off or you left the tavern or whatever, they would give you the guns back. And this is why Hunter was trying to say that he was just a user of narcotics, and that if he wasn't under the influence at the moment that he purchased them or had them afterwards, that it was fine for him to have them. Then on the other possibility is, because he's addicted to cocaine, and the question is, did they prove that? Is the evidence strong enough that he's not just a user but an addict? Addiction could be analogized, instead of to inebriation, to mental illness. If he's in the category of mental illness, if you go back to the founding, there is a tradition for taking guns away from people who are mentally disabled. Although, importantly, the tradition is for people who have been adjudicated as incompetent, not just like the crazy guy down the street that you think is a nut. It's actually like somebody who's been found to be non-compos mentis, institutionalized, or what have you. So these are all things that I think, Greg, for the last 50 years we haven't had to think about, and now we do. So the court is wrestling with how to apply the Second Amendment, with the understanding that even though, as the court says, it doesn't have to be, the regulations of today do not have to be, as they put it, dead ringers for regulations that were in the law at the time of the founding. You have to analogize them to something that was in the regulation or was regulable back at the time of the founding. And then you could try to tease out that principle and apply it to modern conditions. And the court is having a lot of trouble doing that. So the progressives on the court say, Bruen was a mistake. This whole thing is ridiculous. And what we ought to be able to do is, if people think it's sensible to remove the guns from people, we should be able to remove them. The government and the experts should be able to tell us how to do that. And then on the other end, Justice Thomas is basically saying, look, if it wasn't in the law at the time of the founding and it wasn't in the original understanding, you can't do it. You can't take the gun away. And what the rest of the court seems to be saying is there's got to be a rubric for how we tease out principles of what were in the regulations back at the time of the founding and apply them to modern conditions. But they're having big arguments about how to do that. So, for example, Justice Barrett wrote a very thoughtful opinion in this case, which is distinguished both from Justice Thomas's and from Justice Kavanaugh's, about how she thinks an originalist should go about figuring out what the original intent of the Second Amendment was. And what she's basically saying is tradition is something we need to look at, but it's not a free-floating thing that you can rely on divorced from the text of the provision. So you always have to root things back in the text of the provision. And then, Justice Kavanaugh writes this 25-page opinion, which is actually longer than the majority opinion in the case, where he says, well, you can look at, post-ratification evidence and pre-ratification evidence. And he's got like pages and pages of sources of stuff that you can look at. So everybody's grappling with how you do this. And it really hasn't been worked out, to the point that as we sit here today, after Hunter Biden has had his trial, I think the case is really beginning on appeal. It was a slam dunk as far as a jury trial was concerned, but what will happen on appeal? What are the appellate courts going to do this? Are they going to say he's more like a drunkard or somebody who's been who's mentally impaired? Such that he's in the insane sort of category. And if that's what you're relying on, what's your evidence that he was adjudicated that way? He did go to rehab. Is that good enough? So there's a lot of stuff. This is for something that goes back to 1791, this is a very dynamic situation. And I think it's going to take a couple of years to sort it out.
Yeah. And of course, both sides are going to see this as momentum one way or the other. And the left will probably start pushing for more restrictions and that sort of thing, and we'll see where it ends up. But this is an issue that I think a lot of people who are pretty hawkish on the Second Amendment have certainly wrestled with in a number of ways, and it's not surprising to see that pretty hawkish people defending the Second Amendment on the court are wrestling with it.
Right. That's exactly. Those of us who are in favor of Second Amendment rights, just like those of us who are in favor of the free market, we want people who are frauds and crooks to be imprisoned. And if you're in favor of gun rights and you're a law-abiding person, you want people who are criminals. I mean, part of the reason that you have your firearms is to protect yourself from people who are not law-abiding. So we're like the last people who are in favor of guns being in the hands of people who shouldn't have them. But we also don't want to see people's due process rights destroyed.
Exactly, because there could always be a spurious allegation, at which case you could take them away, but you do absolutely want them out of the wrong people's hands. All right, Andy, on to our second major legal story, and a name that has not been in the headlines a lot lately, although it depends on where you get your news from, I guess, but Julian Assange. WikiLeaks. Julian Assange, who's been in custody for a long time. Remember, he was holed up in the Swedish embassy in London for a long time. Then he's extradited to the United States, and kind of all goes back to when Bradley Manning, who's now, of course, Chelsea Manning, gave him classified documents, and then he published them on WikiLeaks and so forth. Then he had more allegations and more documents that he released, I believe, during the 2016 campaign. There's a whole lot of different things that Julian Assange has been part of. But now he's been released from a British prison, and as of last night was on his way to a remote Pacific island where he will plead guilty to a conspiracy charge as part of a plea deal with the U.S. Justice Department. The agreement will free Assange and end the years-long legal battle over the publication of a trove of classified documents. This is the NBC News story. He was charged by criminal information, which typically signifies a plea deal with conspiracy to obtain and disclose national defense information. He will be appearing in a courtroom in a U.S.-controlled territory later this evening, East Coast time, in a territory north of Guam. And I'm happy to report to Congressman Hank Johnson, it has still not tipped over as he was worried about with a beefed up military presence attached to one side of the island. But glad to know things are still stable there. But meanwhile, this is a guy who has become kind of a cause celeb in some circles on the right. Most people in traditional conservative circles knowing that he gave away U.S. Sensitive information during the Iraq War. I don't personally have a lot of sympathy for Julian Assange, but I know mileage tends to vary here. And of course, Obama commuted the sentence of Chelsea Manning, basically because Chelsea Manning became transgender, I think, more than anything related to the case. But nonetheless, it's had a lot of twists and turns over the last 15, probably close to 20 years here in this whole saga. And so what do you make of Assange being free?
Well, I couldn't help but think, Greg, as you were going through the historical record here, what I kept coming back to is if you're Bradley and you have a problem with being Bradley, so you change to Chelsea, how come Manning is okay? You know, I mean, doesn't he have to I mean, don't we need to change the last name? Well, all right. So anyhow, Julian Assange, I have to confess some ignorance here. I had to look up Saipan this morning because I wasn't sure exactly where it is. But Julian Assange is going to plead guilty in the Northern Mariana Islands in an American Commonwealth in the Western Pacific. And I think that's kind of telling because right down to the end, it's like Assange is dictating terms to the United States. He didn't want to come to America, which, you know, frankly, I don't want Assange to come to America. So it's okay with me if he doesn't come. But he didn't want to touch his feet on these shores. So to avoid coming to Virginia, which is where he was indicted in the first place back in 2018, which seems like a long time ago, but was like way too late considering what they charged him for. The accommodation that was made to him so that he wouldn't have to come to the United States because the Biden administration really wanted this plea deal was that they are going to allow him to plead guilty in the Northern Mariana Islands. The deal is that he's going to get time served. Which means he will walk out of jail a free person, and he will be then, I guess, he'll be able to go to Australia, which is where they want him back. I'm with you on Assange. I think that, you know, this turning him into a cult hero, whether it's by this anarchist libertarian element or anti-American radicals of the left, he's a hero to both. But he released, after not only encouraging Manning to steal these documents, but also trying to help him steal them by working out a way that they could crack a security code in the American intelligence CIPRANet, which is the internet system that they have for classified information, which is highly, highly protected. He tried to help Manning break into that. So this is not traditional journalism, right? There's no First Amendment right to commit theft. And all these people who were trying to portray him as, well, you know, he's just a heroic, fearless journalist who's showing the seamy underside of corrupt and aggressive American activity and all that nonsense. And plus, Lady Gaga and Pam Anderson came to visit him. So, I mean, how bad can he be, right? But they released thousands of documents which identified the names of people who were providing information to our armed forces and to our government in places that were either war zones or in places that were run by totalitarian, authoritarian regimes where if you get found out helping the Americans, you could be killed. And they did that indiscriminately. And we don't know what the total damage was for all of that. And for all of the the cartoon kind of coverage that this has gotten in a lot of places, and in a lot of places where I was kind of stunned to see it on what I used to think of as the center right, you know, a country that can't protect its national security secrets can't be a very serious country for long. And I do think that the problem, that, there's two things about the Assange case that I would note. One is, no matter what you think of what Assange did, and I think it's horrific, I think it's the kind of thing that people should get the death penalty for, but it was going to be hard enough to prosecute him because of this kind of overlay that he's kind of like a journalist, because the New York Times and the Washington Post published leaked classified information too. So he's in that kind of ambiguous framework. But the other thing about that, as you point out, Obama disgracefully reduced Manning's sentence from 35 years to 7 years. And I always think in these things, as much as I dislike the quote-unquote journalists who encourage the pilfering of American national security information and then put it out regardless of what the damage done to the country is, the real culprits here to me are always the American officials, because they're the ones who are necessary if you're gonna obtain access to this information so that it can be put out. You have to rely on them to do it. So if the American official who's principally responsible for all this gets 7 years, that kind of puts a ceiling on what you can expect someone like Assange to get in this equation. And he has had, quite the journey here. He was in the, I think it was because, you said Sweden, I think it was because he was under a Swedish allegation of sexual assault that he ended up holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy.
It was Ecuadorian, yeah, that's right.
Yes, in London for 7 years. And they finally had enough of him, because on days when Lady Gaga and Pam Anderson didn't come over, apparently he didn't pick up after the cat, and he was rollerblading or skateboarding around the vestibule in the embassy, and they didn't like that. So finally, they let the Brits come in and take him. And he's actually been in Belmarsh prison for 5 years. So, he's been in some kind of custody or other where he wasn't at liberty for a very, very long time. And as a result, how much more of a sentence he was going to get than he had already gotten would be questionable, even if you could get him here, which would have been difficult because they were not done with the extradition. British extradition is not easy, even though Britain's a close ally of ours. They were going to try to put limits on what kind of sentence he could get here. The death penalty would have been off the table because they don't have death penalty in Europe. So it's typical when we try to extradite criminals from Europe that they insist on no death penalty and, the other barbaric things that we do in the United States in our carceral state that we're running here. So he wasn't going to get much of a sentence anyway, even if you could get him here. The Biden administration just wants this to go away. And the one other thing I would want to say about it, Greg, because this really has gnawed at me for a long time, I think Assange's case, the most telling thing about it is what crap the Russiagate thing was. Because they indicted Assange only for these Chelsea Manning thefts of national security information that went back from like 2009 to 2011. You say to yourself, well, they're going to have a lot of trouble with the statute of limitations on that, even though he's out of the country, because the government, the statute of limitations can be told when someone's out of the country, but only if the government shows they were actually trying to get the guy, which there isn't a lot of evidence that they were doing a whole lot to try to get Assange. They didn't charge him, for example. So what would you obviously do if you were worried about that? Well, you would charge him with what everybody was told was the crime of the century, the collaboration, the collusion between Trump and Russia, because if anybody was guilty in that case, we know Assange was guilty, right? Because wherever he got the DNC emails from, he put them out, right? He encouraged the theft of them, and then he put it out. So if anybody in Russiagate is guilty, it's Assange. They never charged him. And obviously, the reason they never charged him is they wanted an unchallenged political narrative that Russia stole the DNC emails, because they were trying to show that Russia was in some kind of a corrupt conspiracy with Trump. But in point of fact, they can't even prove that Russia did it. And the reason you don't charge Assange is because if they had charged Assange with what they told us again and again and again that he did, they would have had to prove in court that Russia was the culprit. And now I want to be understood here because I always get stuff thrown at me for this. I'm not saying Russia didn't do it. I'm willing to give the benefit of the doubt, although I should probably, seek therapy for this. But I'm willing to give the benefit of the doubt to the intelligence community when they say that Russia was at least complicit in it, if it's not Russia that pulled it off. But believing them, accepting that for argument's sake, is a very big difference between that and saying that you can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt in court. And I think every time that Mueller and the Justice Department got put to their proof, where it was a situation where they might have to try to prove in court that Russia did it, they shrank from it. They dropped a case against one Russian company that challenged them on it, and rather than go to trial and try to prove it, they dropped the case. The media didn't make a big deal about it, but they dropped the case. And with Assange, they never charged him. And I think the reason they didn't charge him was because they couldn't prove it.
No, that's it's been a long, tangled case for a long time. When now you mentioned the DNC aspect of it, I'm sure they didn't want discovery there either on that particular case, and so all sorts of tentacles that go all the way back to an Iraq war that started more than 20 years ago. And so I don't know if this is the end of the Julian Assange saga or just the end of this chapter, but we'll see, I guess, what happens next with him. But a good summation on your part there. Thank you. All right, Andy, final martini for the last couple minutes here. And for this, we just go to Joe Biden. It's officially his Twitter account. I think we can all pretty much assume that he's not the one writing it. But the thought behind it and under his name is certainly a bit chilling here. This was actually coming out on June 20th, so it was back last Thursday. He says we're approaching the first presidential election since the January 6th insurrection. We know who Donald Trump is. The question we have to answer is, who are we? That's what's at stake. And so obviously he's painting Trump as someone who's an existential threat to democracy. We hear it every time he even mentions Donald Trump. The threat to democracy and abortion, I think, are pretty much going to be the whole Democratic playbook this year. But the question then, Andy, is what if he doesn't win? What does Joe Biden have to say then about who we are if he doesn't win? Does that make the American people bad? Does that make the American people gullible? I don't know what he thinks that means about the voting public that he supposedly reveres so much. I guess it's only if he gets the election result he wants, like we've talked about before in the Democrats and democracy. But, it seems to be that the American people are decent and honorable and good only if they reelect me.
Well, look, Greg, the American people did elect Donald Trump once already. So Joe's willing to forgive them for that one. But we're on trial here. Let's not, let's not put it any other way. And look, I think it's a measure of how screwed up things are that you have a guy who's been president for 4 years and he's running on January 6th. And I'm not here to carry a brief for January 6th. I thought January 6th was appalling. For myself, I thought Trump should have been impeached, removed, and disqualified. I think if that had happened, if the Congress had stepped up to the plate and done the right thing instead of rationalizing reasons not to do it, we wouldn't be in the mess we're in now, where Trump has reemerged and he's going to be the candidate. I continue to be convinced that we're now seeing the effects of the lawfare, the second phase of the lawfare campaign against Trump. The first phase was to indict him, galvanize support in the Republican base so that you could stop more suitable candidates from getting traction. And I now think we're in phase two, where the audience is no longer the Republican base. It's the country broadly, where Trump has never been popular. And now what you're going to get is the drip, drip, drip of Biden-driven lawfare, which is, conviction. July 11th, we're going to get sentencing. That's going to leave a mark, too. I expect that once the Supreme Court decides this immunity case this week, more than likely, Whatever is left of it is going to be picked up by Jack Smith, and he's going to try as hard as he can to get to trial prior to Election Day on that. So there's going to be an onslaught of messaging and developments in the criminal justice system that are going to hurt Trump markedly under circumstances where his high water mark ever when he was at his most popular is less than 47%. I don't see how you can win in what's primarily a two-person race in that. So that's what Biden's banking on. And as a result, as you point out, other than abortion, which, Biden hasn't had anything to do with one way or another, I guess, did he well, wait a minute, didn't he sent Kamala Harris to California to perform some abortions? Is that what I'm trying to remember if that was part of the plan?
She's the first president or vice president to visit an abortion clinic. I doubt they
okay.
put her in the scrubs.
She didn't scrub up? Okay. But other than that, his campaign is January 6th. And that's because his administration's been a catastrophe, and there's not anything that he really can run on, because what's he going to plant his feet on otherwise? The economy, inflation, foreign policy, war in the Middle East, the Afghanistan withdrawal. What's he going to run on? So this is what he's got, and this is what we're going to hear about, insurrection and abortion. If I had more rhythm, I'd come up with a song that had that in there, or a rap or something. But that's what insurrection, abortion, insurrection, convicted felon, convicted felon, convicted felon. That's the campaign, and it might work.
Yeah, it might. But going after Trump and throwing all those labels at him, I expect, telling the American people, you either do this the way I want you to, or we've lost the soul of America's. He didn't say that specifically, but it seems to be what it's implying. If you don't vote the right way here, in my perspective, it's a little bit of a bully act, if you ask me. But anyway, one tweet's probably not going to make the difference here. But Andy, thank you so much for subbing for Jim here several times over the past couple of weeks. He is finally trekking his way back from Alaska, so we'll have him back later in the week. But as always, thank you.
It's been my pleasure, and I look forward to having the big guy back.
Absolutely. Andy McCarthy, former Chief Assistant U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. He is a National Review Online contributing editor and columnist and a Fox News contributor. In fact, watch him over the next 3 days. He's going to probably be on a lot analyzing these final Supreme Court decisions of the session. So I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks for being with us today. Do subscribe to the podcast if you don't already, and tell your friends about us as well. Thanks for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch Podcast. Follow us all on X. Andy is at Andrew C. McCarthy. Jim is at Jim Garrity. I'm at Dateline_DC. Have a terrific Tuesday, and join us again on Wednesday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.